Felt like to me that I had to pick a side this season, especially with these CBA negotiations. When Unrivaled was first created, it was created to be an off-season league where players could go during the off-season so that they didn't have to travel overseas. Now that quickly turned into a tool that the players used in these negotiations to counter with the WNBA to try to get the players paid more.
As debates around salaries and revenue sharing continue within the Women's National Basketball Association, one particularly important piece of context often gets overlooked in the public conversation. Many comparisons between the WNBA and the National Basketball Association focus on the present-day financial scale of the two leagues. The NBA generates billions of dollars in annual revenue, while the WNBA operates with a much smaller economic footprint. Because of that difference, critics sometimes argue that WNBA players should receive compensation structures similar to what NBA athletes enjoy today. But there's another way to examine the issue that produces a very different perspective. If you compare the WNBA's current financial proposals with where the NBA stood during its early decades, particularly around the league's 30th season, an interesting pattern emerges. When economists and analysts adjust those historical NBA numbers for inflation and revenue growth, they often find that WNBA players are actually earning a larger share of league revenue than NBA players did at the same stage of development. In other words, relative to the size of the league's business, WNBA compensation may already be ahead of where the NBA was during a comparable moment in its history. That doesn't mean the WNBA salary structure is perfect. It doesn't mean players shouldn't advocate for higher pay. But it does highlight an important point about context. The NBA that fans see today is the result of decades of expansion, television deals, global marketing, and cultural influence. The league didn't reach its current financial scale overnight. It took years of growth, experimentation, and gradual increases in revenue before salaries began to rise dramatically. When conversations skip over that historical timeline and jump directly to comparisons with the NBA's current numbers, the debate can become misleading. Instead of asking how the WNBA compares to a similar stage of development, the discussion shifts toward a comparison with a league that has already completed decades of financial evolution. That difference in framing changes how people interpret the numbers. For players advocating for higher salaries, the argument often centers on fairness and recognition. They see increasing viewership, growing sponsorship deals, and rising cultural visibility as evidence that the league deserves stronger financial rewards. For league executives and financial analysts, the conversation often revolves around sustainability. They focus on revenue streams, operating costs, and the long-term stability of the league's business model. Both perspectives have validity. But when historical comparisons are removed from the conversation, it becomes easier for misunderstandings to develop. And those misunderstandings can quickly turn negotiations into a much more complicated process than they might otherwise be.
They're paying us a lot. They're covering, what the WNBA doesn't cover. And I'm going to be brutally honest with you guys. I don't actually think that Unrivaled gave them any leverage in negotiations. Because you can see from the viewership, Unrivaled can't compete with the WNBA and everything that the WNBA has built over 29 years. And I know Nafisa Collier kept saying, we're running a sustainable business. Unrivaled has only been around for 2 seasons. And while I do think that it was awesome that her and Brianna Stewart were able to put together this league and get a lot of investors and get a lot of sponsors.
Just as discussions around salaries and negotiations were already generating tension, another incident suddenly entered the spotlight and added an entirely different layer to the story. The moment involved Eric Ogunbowale and an altercation that reportedly occurred during a celebration connected to the Unrivaled Championship. According to initial reports, the event took place at Club 11, a popular nightlife venue that frequently hosts large gatherings and high-profile parties. What began as a celebration for players and supporters eventually escalated into a confrontation that drew the attention of authorities. Details are still emerging, but early information suggests there was an incident involving security personnel. Reports indicate that Ogunbowale was involved in an altercation that led to her being escorted out of the venue by security staff. During that process, it is alleged that a physical confrontation occurred in which a security guard was struck in the face with enough force to knock him to the ground. At the moment, investigators and witnesses are still clarifying exactly what happened. Situations like this can often involve multiple perspectives, misunderstandings, and incomplete information. Until all the facts are confirmed, any conclusions would be premature. However, the timing of the incident has made it particularly sensitive. The altercation reportedly occurred at the same venue that had hosted other notable sports-related events in recent weeks, including gatherings involving international athletes. The location itself is well known within Miami's nightlife scene, making the situation even more visible to the public. More importantly, the incident occurred during a period when WNBA players are attempting to present a unified front during ongoing collective bargaining negotiations. When negotiations between leagues and players are underway, public perception can influence how both sides approach the discussion. Any controversy involving prominent athletes has the potential to distract from the core issues being debated. For players seeking better compensation and working conditions, maintaining credibility and solidarity is often crucial. Unexpected incidents, especially those involving legal or disciplinary questions, can complicate that effort. Right now, many people inside the basketball world are waiting to see how the situation develops and whether additional details will change the narrative. But the timing alone has already ensured that the story will remain part of the larger conversation surrounding the future of women's professional basketball.
Who played before, a part of me is like, you want to burn down the league that all of these players helped to build the foundation for in the WNBA. Success was never built overnight in any of these major sporting leagues. Even if you look at the NBA, we talked about this a couple months ago. If we look at the salaries that the players are going to make in the WNBA this season, if they agree to the deal that is on the table, they will actually be making more than NBA players did during their 30th season. If you equate for inflation and all of those types of things, that means that they're actually ahead of where the NBA.
When you step back and look at everything that has unfolded over the past several months, it becomes clear that women's professional basketball is entering a complicated but important moment in its history. Multiple storylines are colliding at once. There are ongoing negotiations between the Women's National Basketball Association and the Women's National Basketball Players Association about the future of player salaries and league economics. Those negotiations will help determine how revenue is distributed and how working conditions evolve in the years ahead. At the same time, the emergence of Unrivaled has introduced a new element into the conversation. What began as an off-season opportunity has gradually become part of a broader discussion about financial alternatives for players. That development alone would have been enough to generate debate. But the situation has grown even more complex because of the overlapping roles held by influential athletes like Breanna Stewart and Nafisa Collier. Their leadership within the Players Association, combined with their involvement in founding Unrivaled, places them at the center of both sides of the evolving landscape. Then there are the public moments, social media posts, club appearances, and unexpected incidents that continue to shape how fans and analysts interpret everything happening behind the scenes. Each new headline adds another layer to a story that is already filled with strategic decisions, financial debates, and questions about the direction of the sport. For players, the stakes are high. The outcome of the collective bargaining agreement will influence their earnings, working conditions, and long-term opportunities. For the league, maintaining stability while continuing to grow its audience remains the central challenge. And for fans, the entire process offers a rare glimpse into the complex business side of professional sports. Ultimately, moments like this often become turning points. The decisions made during negotiations, the relationships formed or strained between leagues and players, and the success or failure of new ventures like Unrivaled will all shape the future of women's basketball. Years from now, people may look back at this period as a moment when the sport was redefining itself. But right now, in the middle of the process, everything still feels uncertain. And until the negotiations conclude and the next season begins, the conversation about power, money, and the direction of women's professional basketball is likely to continue.
I'm rooting for the WNBA to succeed. I'm rooting for the WNBA to remain that premier league, not for a new league to take over. I actually don't want that to happen. And yes, there are so many flaws and there are so many things that the WNBA can do better. But I felt like through all these negotiations, I kind of had to pick a side, and I'm sticking with the WNBA. That's the league I want to see succeed at the end of the day. I think for women's basketball and for the players coming up, the younger players who aren't even in college yet, who have their sights set on playing in the WNBA one day, that is the most sustainable league. That is the one that has been building for many, many years. And that's the one that has the biggest chance of making.
If you really want to understand why the conversation around Unrivaled has become more complicated recently, the best place to start is with the numbers. Statistics often cut through narratives and provide a clearer picture of what's actually happening beneath the surface. And when you examine the viewership data, some surprising details begin to emerge. Television ratings for Unrivaled have reportedly struggled to gain significant traction. That doesn't necessarily mean the league has no audience, but the numbers indicate that it hasn't been able to compete with the level of attention that the Women's National Basketball Association achieved during its most recent season. The difference isn't just a small gap. It's a noticeable separation between the established league and the new off-season experiment. Last year, the WNBA experienced a surge in interest that brought new viewers, record-breaking attendance numbers, and increased media coverage. That growth created the impression that the league was entering a new era of visibility and popularity. Against that backdrop, Unrivaled was expected to benefit from the same wave of enthusiasm surrounding women's basketball. But so far, the viewership results haven't matched those expectations. That context makes one particular moment even more interesting. Just 4 days before the March 10 collective bargaining agreement deadline, a crucial point in negotiations between the WNBA and the Women's National Basketball Players Association, several players posted images from an event at Club 11. The photos included signs reading "Unrivaled Pays Players," accompanied by bullseye emojis. At first glance, the posts might seem playful or celebratory. But timing matters in professional sports negotiations. Posting that kind of message just days before a major labor deadline inevitably sends a signal. Whether intentional or not, it creates the impression that players have an alternative financial opportunity available outside the WNBA structure. For league executives sitting across the negotiating table, that kind of message can carry strategic implications. Negotiations often depend on leverage, the perceived ability of one side to walk away and pursue other options. When players publicly highlight a competing league that promises better pay, it can shift the psychological balance of the conversation. From one perspective, the posts might simply reflect excitement about a new project. From another perspective, they might appear as a form of pressure. Either way, the symbolism of that moment did not go unnoticed. People inside and outside the basketball world immediately began analyzing what the message might mean for the future of the sport. Because once financial alternatives become part of the conversation, the entire negotiation dynamic can start to change.
All we can do is hope that Aaliyah Boston is healthy for the WNBA season, but I do think this really sucks for her. It really sucks for her. It really sucks for fans that she's not able to represent for Team USA. And that also goes back to, something that we've been talking about with these CBA negotiations and about the exclusivity that comes along with it, because Aaliyah Boston is also somebody, if the reports are true, she is somebody who could be eligible for a max contract just this season. And that is something, what I said, if I'm an owner and I'm paying players a max salary contract or a super max and they are my franchise players.
Another factor adding complexity to the entire situation involves leadership roles within the player community. Specifically, attention has turned toward two prominent figures in women's basketball, Napheesa Collier and Breanna Stewart. Both athletes are widely respected within the sport. Their achievements on the court have established them as elite competitors, and their influence among fellow players is significant. But recently, their dual roles in the basketball world have raised questions about potential conflicts of interest. Collier and Stewart are not only professional players. They are also co-founders of Unrivaled, the off-season league that has become part of the broader conversation about WNBA salaries and player opportunities. At the same time, both players hold positions within the leadership structure of the Women's National Basketball Players Association. As members of the executive committee, they participate directly in discussions about the collective bargaining agreement that will determine the future relationship between players and the WNBA. That overlap creates a complicated dynamic. On one hand, their leadership within the Players Association means they are responsible for advocating on behalf of all WNBA athletes. Their role is to help determine whether the league's salary proposals and working conditions meet the expectations of the players they represent. On the other hand, they are also involved in operating a new league that has been promoted as a potential alternative to the WNBA off-season structure. When those two responsibilities exist simultaneously, it naturally raises difficult questions. How do you separate the interests of a new business venture from the interests of an established professional league? How can observers be certain that decisions made during negotiations are purely focused on what benefits the entire player community rather than what might strengthen the position of Unrivaled? To be clear, there is no public evidence suggesting that either Collier or Stewart has acted improperly. Both athletes have long histories of advocating for the well-being of players and the growth of women's basketball. However, the optics of the situation remain complicated. When individuals involved in negotiations also operate a separate league that could potentially benefit from those negotiations failing, the perception of conflict becomes difficult to ignore. In professional sports, perception often matters almost as much as reality. Even the possibility of overlapping interests can become a talking point during high-stakes negotiations. And in this case, that perception has already started shaping how people interpret the broader conversation about salaries, alternatives, and the future direction of women's basketball.